Is the last day that I'm using words. They've gone out, lost their meaning, don't function anymore. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Today is the last day that I'm using words. They've gone out, lost their meaning, don't function anymore. Traveling with logic and reason, traveling to the arms of unconsciousness. Traveling with logic and reason, traveling to the arms of unconsciousness. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Words are useless, especially sentences. They don't stand for anything. How could they explain how I feel? I'm traveling, leaving logic and reason. I'm gonna relax in the arms of unconsciousness. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious. And inside, we're all still wet, longing and yearning. How can I explain how I feel? Let's get unconscious, honey. Let's get unconscious. Let's get unconscious, honey. Let's get unconscious. Never explain again.
Good evening, everybody. everybody, this is Katje. That's a song by Madonna, Bedtime Story, her Bedtime Story album. So that's a really great song by her. I really like that. The name of that song again is Bedtime Story. And so it has a kind of a mystical feeling to it. At this point, Madonna was interested in the Kabbalah, which is a sort of Jewish mysticism, and so she was exploring her own spirituality in connection with that mystical tradition, and some of the music that she made, particularly that track, comes out of her own spiritual explorations at that time in her life. So I really like that track because it's kind of eerie and creepy, and it's a nice introduction to what I would like to talk a little bit about this evening. What I would like to do is go back to this new philosophical or theological conception that I have been developing in some of my recent videos that's based in Kierkegaard, and I want to return to an issue that I briefly touched upon in one of my earlier videos, but I would like to elaborate a little bit more because I think it's important for trying to make this more accessible to a contemporary audience perhaps. So let me just briefly remind you of a couple of aspects of this new conception, this new view, I think I called it, that I have been developing recently. So remember that it's very existential, it's very focused on the person's choice, and that the person's relationship, if the person enters into any kind of relationship with God or a deity, that really is going to come down to the person's own particular radical existential choice. So, for example, without going through all the details again, but those of you who've been following this may remember that on this view that I've been developing, if, to speak about God having some kind of moral qualities of good or evil in the abstract, that doesn't really make any sense. Whether God shows up for a particular individual as something bad or something good is going to come down to the person's own choice about how to feel with respect to certain things that God has done. So, for example, if the person is reflecting on what God has done, in particular that God has become a human being in Jesus Christ, and this then allowed this person, this human being, to be executed in a particularly gruesome way with the purpose of causing the individual who's reflecting on this to feel sorrow about that, depending on whether that person reacts to this situation, this realization, with, let's say, indifference or outrage on the one hand, or gratitude on the other. That's going to determine whether God shows up for that person, in fact is for that person something evil and malevolent on the one hand, or something good and benevolent on the other. God doesn't have any moral qualities at all, independently of how I choose to react to what he has done. And another version of this same idea, another level of the same idea, is that God doesn't even have real actuality for me unless I'm inspired by certain kind of stories that I read about or hear about concerning God. I gave the example of the story of Abraham in the Old Testament. That's very important to Kierkegaard, where God comes across as a merciful tester. Abraham he successfully passes this test, so he becomes a successful and a rewarded knight of faith. And depending, if I'm inspired by this story, if I have this deep sense of inspiration, then the God who's manifested in this story, this sort of tripartite or triune God that we talked about, that's something real for me. If I don't, though, if I'm not inspired, if I'm left indifferent, or maybe even just have a kind of nonplussed or puzzled or deer in the headlights look when I hear these stories, then God then just remains for me something purely conceivable or possible, not something actual that has an actual bearing upon my life. So what I wanted to talk about briefly this evening is the situation of, well, what is it for somebody, again, the person, is reflecting on this story, and suppose that the person reacts to the story, doesn't have any reaction to it, is either indifferent or reacts to it by being completely puzzled and perplexed by it, the way Johannes Silentio in Fear and Trembling is. Suppose that that person is not inspired by the story. So remember, in terms of these various interrelationships that we were discussing in a previous video, the person is not an inspired one by the story, and so the person does not have inspiration and filiation with respect to the characters in this story. So then those characters are not inspiring the person, and so they do not possess paternity and filiation with respect to the person. And since there's only one paternity, inspiration, filiation, there's only one kind of threefold relationship there that sort of holds the whole story together, that's supposed to be made actual by the person who hears or reads the story being inspired by it. If she isn't, or if he isn't, then that sort of divine possibility is not an actuality for her. So suppose that's the case. Suppose that somebody is just indifferent to the story, or maybe the person is completely puzzled or confused by it, or just is certainly not inspired by it, so that this God that's revealed in the story is not real for the person. So the question, remember, one of the questions that came up at this point was, well, how is that person really punished? If there isn't any God for that person, then presumably that person isn't going to be sent to hell by God, or isn't going to be punished or excluded in any way by God. So how does that fit into the sort of traditional picture of, let's say, damnation or alienation from God, which is, well, when somebody doesn't really have faith, that person then is sort of left out and punished. How does punishment figure into this picture? Now, I wanted to say something a little bit more by way of explanation here in terms of the view that I've been developing. And what I wanted to say is that, remember, my initial response to that, and I stand by it, is, well, look, if the person in that situation who's either indifferent or completely puzzled by this story and certainly isn't inspired by it, for that person, since God isn't anything real, that person doesn't even have the possibility of entering into a deeper relationship with God. That is, that person doesn't even have the possibility of, well, not only is God real for the person, but then seeing that God has brought about, has become a human being in Christ with the purpose of dying and allowing this innocent person to die. And the point of that is to induce sorrow in the person who believes in God, where if the person responds to that sorrow with gratitude, then that sorrow that the person feels becomes that person's way of paying or sort of offsetting her sins, any sins that she committed. She's now atoning for them, or she's actually undergoing a punishment. The sorrow serves as a kind of redemptive suffering that offsets any sins that she's committed, or offsets the condition of being in a situation where she might find herself unable to fulfill all the moral requirements that are binding on her, and so she can't enter into, she can't be perfect. This is something I talked about in connection with moral dilemmas. So if God doesn't exist for the person, that isn't even a possibility. Now, why is that a punishment? Well, it might be a punishment in this way, and that is that it's not so much that the person is going to be sent to hell and is going to suffer an eternity of torment, hellfire or things like that. The problem is not so much that the person is going to be subjected to some kind of negative feeling or torment or something like that. It's that the person is going to miss out on something truly wonderful. Because if the person believes in God, if the person is inspired by the relevant story so that God is actual for her, and then the person then sees that God has become a human being who then suffers and dies in this particularly gruesome way, a crucifixion, the point of which is to make the person reflecting on that situation feel sorrow, and the person feels gratitude, and the person also knows that this individual who died on the cross has now risen from the dead. And so if the person feels gratitude for the sorrow that she's feeling, she will then be with Christ and God in eternity in a joyful way. So what's problematic for someone, at least on the view that I've been developing, what counts as a punishment is not so much that for the person who doesn't believe in God or isn't inspired, so that God isn't something actual for her. It's not that she then suffers all these horrendous torments and hellfire. It's that she misses out even on the possibility of that. Since God isn't anything actual for her, there's no way for her ever to enjoy this wonderful, very powerful, eternal blessedness that she would enjoy if she believed. At least it would open the door to that, and the door here has been shut. And there isn't any avenue to that. And the reason I'm saying this is I think that in a lot of times when people are talking about religion and Christianity today, there's a lot of, and when they're talking about damnation and hell and all that, there's a lot of emphasis on the negative. Whereas what we really should be emphasizing is the reason that you should want to be with God or want to have this kind of eternal relationship is not so much to avoid torment and hellfire and all the rest of it, is that you don't want to miss out on something wonderful. And let me give you an example. Suppose that you really love somebody else, and suppose you think about the happiest day of your life. What is the experience that has made you the happiest, whatever that may be, and each one of you could fill that in. So suppose you think about this experience, and then there's somebody else that you love very, very much, and you would want that person to have that experience. If you really love them, then you would want them to have that experience. And if they didn't have that experience, you would feel sorry for them, and in some way it would be almost tragic that they can't enjoy it. And so that's the way I think we ought to be conceiving the importance of trying to have the right relationship with this deity, not so much because we want to avoid something that's bad, torture or whatever, is that we don't want the person to miss out on something that's very, very wonderful. And finally, this fits quite well with a lot of what Kierkegaard says, for example, in The Sickness Unto Death, where he's talking about despair. Sin is a kind of despair. And somebody might be in a condition of despair without even really knowing it. Now, I suppose that on the view that I'm describing, someone who isn't inspired by the relevant biblical or traditional stories, somebody who isn't inspired by those stories, and so somebody for whom God isn't really actual, is simply a character in a story or something possible or conceivable without being real, that person in a way is kind of pathetic, because the person is missing out on something wonderful, on a wonderful opportunity that would be available to her if she were to be inspired by the stories and then to respond to her own sorrow over what God has done in the proper way, that is, with gratitude. If she doesn't do any of those things, then she really is in a very, very terrible situation, even though she may not know it, and she may not register it, she may not be experiencing any horrible torture or hellfire or any kind of punishment like that. But her condition is pathetic, or her condition is really very, very sad, because she's missing out on something that is, in fact, supposed to be very, very wonderful, and there's something very sad about that. So that's what I wanted to say. And again, I think it's important to emphasize the positive here, not so much to get caught up on the negative and trying to make people believe in God, because that way they can avoid being punished, subjected to all kinds of horrendous torment. It's that we want them to believe these things so that they won't miss out on something that is truly, truly wonderful. Just like if you really love somebody, you wouldn't want them to miss out on what makes you happy, or the most wonderful experience that you could describe or could remember from your own life. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this evening. And I thank you for joining me. I'm sorry if I've gone on a bit long, but I didn't want to go back to this because I think it's important. I find it very interesting, and I hope you do too. But this is Katje Eckhart, and I thank everybody for joining me this evening. Until next time, I wish everybody a restful and a peaceful good night. Thank you again. Bye-bye.